Hi, everybody. I'm Nina Boski for the Best Classics Ever channel, and right here on Classic Nina, where we're bringing the past present. And I've got one of my favorite guests. She is the old Hollywood expert. She's got April's Old Hollywood. She has the Hollywood walking tour. She is all about Hollywood, old Hollywood. And you always remind me of old Hollywood when I see you too. So it's so fun to have you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's good to be here.
Well, this is a fun show because she's one of the most intriguing actresses, alluring actresses that I actually don't know that much about, but we're going to learn about her today. Her name is Ava Gardner, and I'm excited to talk to you about her because she seems a little mysterious to me. You always hear things about her, but you're not quite sure. It's almost like you can't put your finger on her. You know what I mean? She's always eluding you on some level. So maybe we're going to take out that mystique today, and maybe it's going to keep that mystique going. So, April, before we get into, her background and who she was, etc., what made you intrigued about Ava Gardner?
I had started reading biographies of classic Hollywood stars, and she was one of the names that would come up, in the first few books that I read. And she sounded fascinating, and any story I read about her, it just made me interested in her. And so I had to pick up a book about her and say, what was her life like? Because she does have such a glamorous mystique about her. And I'm a sucker for somebody with a interesting life story. And so that sparked my interest.
Well, you think about her and, you think about all the actors and actresses that flock to Hollywood each year to, quote, make it. And here she was, 18, 19 years old. She has some picture, what is it, in New York City or something, and she gets discovered. And by 19, she's at MGM. Is that the story? And is that the correct story? That's not just a rumor?
You got it. Got it.
About that, it was her destiny to become an actress. And within a year or something, she was married for the first time to Mickey Rooney. And what about that relationship did you hear or read about that you can kind of give some light into Ava and that relationship? Because I would never see those two together.
Yeah, I think that they were attracted to each other's energy and youth and glamour and excitement. Ava had not really been discovered by Hollywood at that point. Yes, she had a starlet contract, but she was just doing little bit parts. And she actually met Mickey Rooney on her first day at the studio when they were giving her a tour. And so they went onto the stage where he was shooting a number dressed as Carmen Miranda. So imagine that, or Google that, and you can see the photo. But he laid eyes on her, and he was a big womanizer, and so he thought, I have to have her. So he put everything into chasing her, and she did a very Southern thing. She turned him down, and he was like, "Who is this starlet turning me down? Like, who does she think she is?" So he kept calling, she kept saying no, and they do this pattern for a while, and then she finally goes out with him, and it was so exciting. Like, she was new to Hollywood, and he was taking her to all of these exciting places and meeting all of these interesting people. And I think they just had a really great time together. And she did the same, I'm going to say no 36 times before I say yes, the kind of thing with the proposal. But in those days, you got married, and she was committed to not getting married until she was 19. Her grandmother had married, or no, I'm sorry, her mother married at that age, and then her older sister had married at that age. So she didn't want to get married until that point. But, people didn't live together and do all of that back then. So I think it was just a fun, exciting romance of, two people who were really young, and it's just the very start of their careers in a very exciting time in America.
Well, when you look at her as well, I think that a pattern that I see play out quite a bit, particularly what you're telling me in terms of Mickey Rooney, but also in her relationship with Frank Sinatra, that also kind of creates that alluring, is that she can't be tamed or controlled.
Yes,
To live
yes.
life on her terms versus on what society, almost in that era, where women were destined to get married and be kind of the tamed, controlled housewife. She didn't at 19 was still not what's the word, conforming
Mhm.
to society's terms, and that relationship ended quite quickly. And if I read correctly, she also said that he was cruel. And is that correct, or is that just a rumor?
I've read that he hit her. I don't. There are a lot of books about Ava Gardner, and there are a lot of things that are said about her. So I have read that. Who knows if it was true, but I think that she was not a person that was going to be tamed, and she did have an element to her personality that kind of wanted to be out and see the world and be involved in exciting things and doing the laundry and dishes, and you know that's not it, for me either, so I totally understand her.
Yeah,
But
and you know what? Also, April, we have to put ourselves back in that time period. For
mhm.
you and I, in the age that we live in, it would be called complete abuse. But every time I see a touch of mink and I see Cary Grant, who I love and adore, hit Doris Day, right? Snap
Yeah.
out of it, and like almost scolding her like a child. A lot of that kind of husband wife mentality back then was accepted much more than it would be today. We'd call it abuse. Back then it could have been a way of life. I'm not sure, your
I
take on
think it was a lot more common back then. I also do know, I'm not saying this specifically about Mickey Rooney, but I do know with other men, Ava hit back.
it. Well, let's move to the second marriage. The second marriage, Artie Shaw, who was also married to Lana Turner, he was known to be abusive. And so what happened in that relationship as well?
If we want to talk about abuse in that relationship, I feel like it was much more emotional
Hmm.
than physical. Yes, maybe there could have been some physical abuse, but he married her, and he was an intellectual, and loved to read, and always loved to kind of pontificate and tell stories. And Ava was from North Carolina, and she did go to college for a year, a secretarial sort of thing. That was what women did back then. But he made her feel really bad about not having an education, or an official education, and not being well read. And so he would give her books and ask her to read these things to better herself. And even in front of people, he would berate her or embarrass her in front of a group of people, just in a way that probably a husband and wife would never speak to each other in public now. And she really loved him, and she was very young. And I think she was just at this really impressionable phase where, for someone that you almost idolize, to constantly put you down, really leaves a mark. And she does talk about in her autobiography how much hurt that caused her. And she even says, I don't think that he meant to, or he understood what he was doing to me.
Mm, wow. Well, most abusers don't, they just, it's kind of a robotic reactionary thing that they do. And back then certainly didn't have the tools that we have today. So, that was Artie Shaw. And then there's the infamous, very infamous, Ava Gardner. I've done some shows around Frank Sinatra. And it sounds like Ava and Frank, Ava at the height of her career, and Frank at the lowest part of his career. Talk about volatile relationship. Tell us a little bit about that relationship.
That relationship was for both of them, the love of their life. And it never really ended. They fell for each other very hard. They were both extremely jealous and temperamental, and they would just set each other off, and they were very evenly matched, I think, as opposed to, Artie Shaw. Frank Sinatra would, get jealous of someone, and then she would get mad that he was jealous and stalk off, and they fought, and then they made up just as passionately. But it was a really passionate love affair, and it was one of those can't live with you, can't live without you type of things. And when they broke up, or the marriage broke up, she and Frank stayed in touch for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, very good friends. I got the chance to interview Tom Dreesen, who was on the road with Frank Sinatra for about 14 years. And one of the things he said, because I always said that too, I thought, Barbara Sinatra, he was married to the longest. And one of the things that I noticed in kind of researching him too was the fact that he seemed a little bit more relaxed as he got older. And so I said, it's really interesting, because I think about Ava, and I think about the passion, I think about love of life, right? And he asked Frank that, like, who was the love of your life? And his comeback was, and I thought this was interesting, was that you have a love for different areas of your life. Ava was the right love at that time in my life. And I think about that from the perspective of, my childhood sweetheart to the person that I'm, my partner of today. Very different loves at different times in your life. And that started to make more sense. It doesn't make Barbara or any of her, Nancy, the mother of his children, any different, but you certainly felt their passion. And, particularly for Frank Sinatra to be so needy of her, where he didn't display that in any other area really of his life, that was kind of interesting, his vulnerability that he had with her as well. So, that's also creates that lure. The other thing that he said, and I don't know if you've heard this as well, is that, they would drink, is it whiskey or bourbon every night? They would just drink, and then they would fight, and then they would make up. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like this kind of, volatile kind of relationship. And, and he would try to get her not to go do a movie or something like that. And she'd say, not only am I going to do the movie, but I'm going to go and sleep with the director and see about that. You know what I mean? And talking about, fuel on the fire, given their relationship, I mean, certainly had a will and a tenacity to not live life in the standard Southern belle, let alone, Hollywood wife at that time either, So what are some other things that we don't know about Ava Gardner?
Regarding what you were just saying, Ava was the baby of her family by several years. And I do think that influenced her personality in being less subservient. I believe she even, says, she was kind of spoiled. She, her older sisters, some of them were old, they were teenagers or even older. I think that formed and shaped her. And one thing that I found really interesting about her is that, at the beginning of this podcast, you talked about her mystique and how you can't quite put your finger on what is it about her. And, you're just trying to understand her, and she eludes you. And I think Ava wanted it that way. She was an extremely private person. I think one of the things that drove her and Frank apart was the fact that people wouldn't leave them alone to be able to live their lives. They had such a passionate relationship, and she, you have to remember, it's not just two passionate people together. It's two passionate people under a microscope in front of the entire world. He's married. She's a home wrecker. She's getting called all of these names in the press, and people are following them. And, so that there's that part of it. And Ava hated that so much that she left the United States. She made Pandora and the Flying Dutchman in Spain, and she was introduced to the culture there. And she did a few other movies in Europe, and she was particularly taken with the culture of Spain. It suited her. She learned to dance the flamenco, and she got very good at that. That was one of her favorite things to do. She picked up and moved to Spain and was there, I believe, until around 1968. And then she moved to London and she lived there for the rest of her life. So she left the United States and all of that paparazzi and craziness. And another interesting thing about her is that I think if you look at the roles that she chose after she was able to be free from the studio system, you get a sense of her personality. I think I have a love-hate relationship with the studio system. I love things about it. I hate things about it. And Ava really hated it, but it did allow her to be known by the public and to learn to act, and, you know, to be at a point that when she was able to get finished with her contract at MGM, she was still able to work. And so some of her later films, you know, are, you know, she's in all, you know, 70s disaster movies and, you know, playing all these interesting older character types. So that was something that I just imagined her, this young, glamorous, you know, usually the other woman, you know, that vampy type.
Fatale, you know what I mean? That's, you know, she was playing those kind of characters early on, and then she gets with Frank, and that label kind of stayed for a long time. And so to break out of that, because she was much more than that, obviously, you know, she's got some huge, you know, roots in terms of her, was it North Carolina that she was from? You know, so she's got that, you know, big family, very, very different. You know, I found it interesting too that she was, you know, born into a Christian family, but later in life, it sounds like she became an atheist. Is that correct?
I don't know
Okay.
on that topic, but I do know that she loved to go to you know, she grew up during segregation, and, you know, certainly churches aren't really segregated, but she loved to go to the Black church.
Yeah.
Because she loved their expressiveness and their singing, and she loved the way the preachers were so, you know, dramatic and forceful, and the reaction from the people. She loved that. And you know, that's her personality to me, is just someone who really wanted to live and experience life in the fullest possible way. And there is a great quote where she said, you know, I've enjoyed my life, and if I had it to do over, I would probably do exactly the same things, just maybe a few minor changes here or there, but nothing big, you know. And may we all be able to say that.
Yeah, you know, I think it's also, you know, she not only herself, but also with Frank as well, stood up for civil rights during that time. And I think her assistant was African American, and back then, you know, that became more of a challenge at times as well. So she just would not see color, and certainly, you know, stood up for those times in life where, you know, before segregation was a quote abolished, that she was not going to stand for it. So that makes a lot of sense that she would intermingle in Black churches where, you know, the reality is she looked at it as, in which we all should, which is all the difference between me and somebody else is potentially the color of my skin, and that's about it. So the fact that she had a strong, you know, constitution as it relates to that, because a lot of people, you know, they just follow the norm, and again, she didn't follow the norm, you know. And so let me ask you another question. I heard that she had a long-standing relationship with Howard Hughes. Is that correct as well?
That's right.
Yeah, so
And
tell me a little more about that relationship. That seems interesting, and both a little eccentric, him more so, but let's talk a little bit about that.
well, Ava was like any of the other young starlets that were rising during the time that Howard Hughes was in Hollywood. He dated everybody. And I'm fascinated with that because the descriptions of him are never flattering, but he must have just had some sort of charisma or charm in person, because everybody went out with him. And yes, some of them were probably chasing his millions, but others, that not everybody's like that.
Well, she didn't
And
have to really think about all the people that she was exposed to as well,
he set up a meeting with her, and she was not really paying a lot of attention. And she thought she was going to be meeting Howard Hawks, the director. She didn't even pay attention. And he came in, and he said something about, a movie that he had made. He was, and she thought he was coming on to her and made a snappy remark. And he said, Hell's Angels. And she was like, oh, okay. I know that movie. But she went on dates, and he was very jealous. She says they never had a sexual relationship. I tend to believe that, because she is not a kind of person that holds back or changes her story very often. So, I think that she would have told the truth, but she was like, I just no. But I guess she found some pleasure in his company. And one thing that is true is, when you're a young girl, like, you like to be entertained and, wined and dined and taken out. And there is this famous story where he took her for a weekend to San Francisco, and he had this huge proposal planned with all these jewels. And Ava was chaperoned to Hollywood by her older sister, who the nickname was Bappy. So I'm going to call her Bappy, because if you've heard of her, that's how you know her. And Bappy could not understand how Ava was turning down Howard Hughes and the millions of dollars and all these jewels. But Ava was her own person, and they go on this trip. He picks her up in a jalopy, like a truck without a hood on it, where the engine's exposed. She throws a fit. She's not going to go. She had packed all her nice clothes. She had really gotten excited for this trip. And just over and over, he does these things that are just so embarrassing to her. On the train to San Francisco, he asks her to meet him in the dining car, and she sits there, and he's really late. And then he comes in this suit that she just describes as being, something that his father probably didn't want, and like buried in the back of his closet 20 years ago, so he comes in this, she's so embarrassed, then he takes her to a store, leaves her there, and he goes off, and he tells her to buy whatever she wants. And she's not that kind of person. So she doesn't. And she's just pissed that he's left her all alone, and he's doing all these things. And what he was doing was picking out jewelry for her for this big proposal he was going to do. And she kind of figured out his game, and she got furious, and she refused to speak to him. He called her sister Bappy, flew her to San Francisco. Bappy went back and forth between Howard's room and Ava's room for a whole day, communicating between them. But that was their relationship. He was scheming and plotting and wanted to marry her, but I think there was a deeper friendship there. And I think that they were friends for around 20 years, or in touch for that amount of time. And he would do favors. When her mother passed away, they couldn't get a flight to get to the services. Mm-hmm. And he kicked a couple generals off one of his flights and flew her there.
Hey, he's a good friend to have when you're in a pinch like that, right? So
he also, if she was bored and wanted to go to Mexico and go shopping, he flew her there a couple of times. And so I think it was a very glamorous and exciting thing for her to be in his life. And I don't think she had to make a lot of sacrifice. But I don't want to give the impression that she's a person that took advantage of people, because I think that as much as I've read about her, if she didn't like someone, she didn't care.
Yeah.
Just like Howard Hughes proposing to her. She liked him, but she didn't want to marry him. So he could give her millions of dollars of jewels, and she'd just throw them back in his face.
Yeah, the term that keeps coming is life on my terms. And
Yes.
and I think, particularly back then, but even now today, that level of you can't tame that type of person. She's going to live the way that she wants to live. And what's kind of interesting too is back in the day, and this is when I was reading up on her, it dawned on me. I remember hearing this story. So back in my young media days, I was probably in my late 20s. There was a corporate lawyer that we had in my television network, and he was an old Hollywood lawyer for Ernest Hemingway and some of the old stars. So he tells me this story, and I forgot Ava Gardner was on the plane. So they would go down, not one time, but multiple times down to Cuba. And these wild things that would go on. I mean, seriously, I'm sitting there going to myself, wow. And so when I was reading up on her, I go, oh my God, I forgot Ava Gardner was on that flight too. You know what I mean? And so she was certainly had a little bit, and a lot of the stars back then had a little bit of a wild flair to them. So let's talk a little bit about Ernest Hemingway and their friendship, because they were together, as in terms of each other's lives for a long time as well.
She did a couple of Ernest Hemingway's stories adapted for film before she met him. And she met him when she was living in Spain, and she was with the famous bullfighter, Luis Miguel. And so he brings in Ernest Hemingway to visit her. She was in the hospital. I believe she had kidney stones or something. And he was standing outside the door, and she was on the phone with MGM, and they were telling her she was going to be doing a movie, and she was telling them she most certainly was not going to be doing that movie, in very colorful language in front of all these nuns at this hospital where she's staying. And Ernest Hemingway was like, wow, okay. And then she hangs up the phone. They bring in Ernest Hemingway, and she says, oh my goodness, I can't believe you came all the way here to see me. I am so flattered. And she just switches on the Southern Belle thing. And that really appealed to him.
Yeah, I could imagine, because he had his own flamboyant personality as well. So, I mean, he certainly didn't live life in the lines, let's just say,
Yeah, I believe they were sort of kindred spirits, and they immediately recognized that about each other.
Yeah, that is such an interesting one. So the other thing I was going to ask you is, when she was involved with Frank Sinatra, she, back then, I mean, it was in her contract that she couldn't get pregnant, but a lot of women went on to have children and stuff, but yet she chose abortion. Did she ever have her own kids? And what was her feelings about that later in life, not having kids?
She never had children, and she did have an abortion when she was with Frank Sinatra, and it was a decision she made on her own, and it was really hurtful to him. But she always felt like she did not want to bring a child into an unstable atmosphere.
Mhm.
And during any of her marriages, she wasn't ready, I think, to have children early on. And then with Frank, their relationship was so volatile that she felt like unless you were totally prepared to provide a stable home and life for that child, including, I think, not working and being able to stay home, during the early years of the child's life, then she just felt like that wasn't something that she wanted to do. So I don't know that she really had strong feelings one way or the other about having children.
Mhm.
But I do know that when she had an opportunity at least once, she felt like her life wasn't in the right place to bring a child in.
And it's such a wonderful time to bring this up, because you have a lovely little girl, and her name is Ava. So
Yeah.
was she named after Ava Gardner, given your affection for old Hollywood?
I say yes and no. When I was pregnant, I found out it was going to be a girl. I wanted her to have a name that was classic and evocative of old Hollywood without being really on the nose. And I really went through all of these different names, and I just, some of them sounded so old fashioned and some of them were just too, but Ava just was the perfect name to me. It was so elegant. And I really tried to find a name that sounded like a movie star of that era without being the name of one.
Yeah.
But I just kept coming back to Ava, and you know, she was just so, her name was so elegant to me.
Yeah.
And evocative. So that's kind of where that name comes from. And it does feel like a classic Hollywood name. And I don't want her to grow up to be just like Ava Gardner, but I I do want her to have that same sort of fire and spirit and love of life that Ava had.
And would you say that, given your, knowledge of her, obviously she's been part of your virtual tour, would you say that that's really kind of the essence of her, that love of life, not being contained? I wouldn't say the femme fatale, because she certainly has more to her than that. I think she got labeled that because of the Frank Sinatra and the roles that she was playing at that time. But she certainly, that term, life on my terms, so to speak, and adventuresome. She seems very adventuresome. Like, I'm just going to, keep doing what it is that I want to do and not be defined in this box of what you think I should be, because I'm a movie star, or I come from the South, or I should get married because that's what women do.
I think that is the essence of her. And I think there's a little side to her that fought and when you tried to put her in a box.
Yeah.
I think that's where that really fiery side of her comes out. I think that people loved her. I can't really think of any negative story that I've read about her other than her being called a home wrecker and all of that. But for people that knew her, it doesn't seem like anyone really disliked her. But there's that side that comes out when you tried to tell her what to be and what to do. And I feel like I have that side of me too. So that sticks out. I understand that.
Well, the other thing I read about her as well, and I wonder, I mean, because there was that, you and I have talked about Marilyn Monroe in the past, and Marilyn has a very different sex appeal than Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner is very sultry. And so I remember reading about her that the wives of the husbands, that if when she'd walk in the room, wives would be like, oh gosh, what do you, don't look at my husband today, kind of thing. And she seemed to have that alluring quality about her as well. Probably, what do you think that was about in terms of that? Because she's one of those stars that, didn't have the notoriety, let's say, that a Marilyn Monroe had, but certainly had that sultry seductiveness that I'm sure wives of husbands probably said, oh my gosh, please look the other way. Don't look at my husband that way.
Well, she had that quality very early on. There's a story about her being picked up by an MGM representative from the train. And when she first comes to Hollywood, and he takes her to a party, just, they just stop in and just introduce it. So she is literally fresh off the train and no MGM treatment, no, just her own clothes, and she goes into this party, and it said everybody turned and looked at her, the men in one way and the women in the way that you just described. And so they were there for a little bit. He introduced her to a few people, and then he left. And the person telling the story said, that just sucked the life out of the party, this young woman. And I think that comes from I think she had a very strong sense of self and a very strong sense of confidence, and combine that with the beauty that she had. And when you think about who was, people being just chosen off the street for their beauty and how that doesn't happen today. There are very simple things, like in the 40s, people didn't get braces. If your teeth were crooked, they were just crooked. We didn't have all the skincare things that we have today.
I mean, women would put, I think even Marilyn did at the time, Vaseline on their face. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So for someone who just had even features and straight teeth, and let alone somebody that looks like she looked just naturally, that was a person that was going to turn heads. I mean, I think everybody today does a lot to enhance their own look. We have a lot more tools at our disposal for that than people had back then. So I think that combination of her strong sense of self and confidence that she exuded, combined with her beauty, could be very intimidating to another woman.
Do you think she had any regrets?
She doesn't say this ever, but so I'm totally editorializing here. But I do think that she regretted not being able to find that peace in a home. And you can take this for what it's worth, because as I said earlier, she said she wouldn't live her life differently, but I think she really admired the marriage that her parents had and the home that they provided. And I think, had the cards been turned a different way, I think she might have enjoyed that.
Yeah, she she certainly, especially, moving out of the country and then coming back and doing different kind of roles and stuff. But she died pretty young. What do you think that was about? Was that more about the, hard years of living that hard life in terms of partying and drinking and all that stuff? What do you think that was, because it seems like, 60, was it 67, 68 that she passed away? She really certainly died at a very young age.
She lived hard. And but she had a stroke, and then she died a few years after that, but her health started to fail, and her body just wasn't what it was. And she does talk a lot in her autobiography about the stroke and the effect that it had on her. And I think that would be when if you're used to, as you get older, you can't do the things that you used to be able to do. And I think that would be very disheartening, especially for someone who loved to get out and experience life. But she did say, she wanted to go with a glass of champagne in one hand and a cigarette in the other. And the night that she died, which is January 25th, coming up. Yeah. There was a huge storm that went through London, and it knocked down all these trees. It was just this really big, one of those storms that people talk about years later. Remember the big storm? But that was the night that she passed away. And her maid and companion told her neighbor the next day, Ava got her wish. So I think she did get to go exactly how she wanted, with a glass of champagne in one hand.
Life on
her terms. Exactly.
Leave this earth on my terms. Did she ever talk about like her favorite movies and least favorite movies that she did?
I think she felt about her movies in terms of how much she enjoyed the experience, more so than how they turned out. There was a film, that The Barefoot Contessa, I believe, where the advertising campaign labeled her the world's most beautiful animal.
Oh gosh.
And she hated that. She's like, that's going to follow me around for the rest of my life. She hated labels and things like that. But I think she really appreciated The Killers. Because, and that's a breakout role for her. But she said it was also the first time she felt like she was treated as an actress, and she rose to the expectation, and she became interested in the character, and she realized that there was more to this movie thing, than just having to stand around and look pretty or do cheesecake shots. So that's one that I do remember her saying, she appreciated that opportunity and being able to do that role.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, that she too, relatively young, decided to kind of leave Hollywood and do life again, the way that she wanted to. What do you think she would want to be remembered as? What do you think? We're saying life on your terms, adventuresome, etc. But, given all that you know about her and the virtual tour that you give about her life, what do you think? How do you think she would want to be remembered?
I think she would want to be remembered as a person
Mhm.
and not this Hollywood personality, femme fatale. I think she would want people to understand her as someone who lived a full life and made the choices that she felt were right for her, and someone that stood up for herself. And I think if she knew that that kind of example inspired other people to live their lives that way instead of just doing what was expected or what they were told to do, I think that that would make her very happy.
Well, we do this with Marilyn Monroe, where she would say, hold a good thought for Marilyn as, she was going to do something scary, etc. And I'm going to say the same thing as we are, up against the anniversary of her passing with Ava Gardner. And let's hold a good thought wherever she is, angel flying free, living life on the other side, hopefully on her terms. And I just want to say thank you so much for being on the show today. And how can people reach you? And can they also on demand watch the virtual Ava Gardner tour? How does that work?
I am working on that, but the short answer is if you get in touch with me, which you can do on, there's Old Hollywood Tour is a website that has my contact info. Also, April Clemmer, and my name is spelled like the month April, and then Clemmer. But either one of those has a contact form where you can send me an email, and I'll send you secret instructions on how you can watch that until I get it up in a more rentable form on Vimeo.
Now you have some upcoming walking tours as well as that you're going to be doing this year. What are you going to be doing this year in terms of the walking tours, aka as long as the pandemic doesn't shut us down once again? So what will you be doing this year?
The walking tour is still offered. It's outdoors. And there are headsets so people can safely social distance.
Right.
You can find dates on Eventbrite or on aprilclemmer.com or oldhollywoodtour.com. And my virtual events are listed there as well. And those, the next one coming up is going to be about the Pacific Theater in Hollywood, which is formerly the Warner Brothers Theater. It's completely boarded up now. We're going to talk about why it was built, what happened there, why is it boarded up, what's inside, all kinds of exciting things. And for virtual events, you do, if you buy a ticket but can't watch the day of, you do get a link to the recording, so you can watch it that way too.
That's wonderful. Well, as always, I know we're going to have you back this year, but just want to say thank you so much for spending some time and talking about this wonderful actress that I'm glad gets a little light shine her way, because she certainly brought a lot to the table and to life, Ava Gardner. So thank you, April Clemmer. And as always, we'll see you again.
So, hey, Nina, one last thing. I want to recognize the Ava Gardner Museum, which is in North Carolina, for all of the help they gave me as I was researching Ava. So if you are ever headed to North Carolina, I highly recommend checking them out. If you are really far away like me, they have a lot of really cool virtual events, and they have books, different little bits of merch that you can get. And it's a really amazing treasure trove of all things Ava Gardner. So I just want to throw that out if anyone's interested in it. It's called the Ava Gardner Museum.
All right, so you can go ahead and Google that as well. I'm sure it's in the Google of being able to find out more about Ava Gardner. So again, thank you, April Clemmer. I'm Nina Boski for the Best Classics Ever channel right here on Classic Nina, where we are bringing the past present.